Our speakers today are Professor Thomas Kochan and Dr. Christine Derry of the MIT Sloan School of Management. After the first wave of the COVID-19 pandemic forced the closure of many businesses, many places have begun the first phases of reopening and return to work. Many people, especially knowledge workers, have been able to work remotely. However, manufacturing, transportation, agriculture, personal services, hospitalities, restaurants, and food industry, just to name a few, require workers to be present at their place of employment. Beside implementing measures at work to assure the health and safety of workers, employers will have to renegotiate their relationship with employees. In this webinar, Professor Kochan and Dr. Derry will share their thoughts about the return to work and the work of the future, not only in the United States, but worldwide. To make this webinar more interactive, Tom Kochan will speak first, and then Christine Derry will speak, and the last portion of the webinar, they will both be in a conversation and can answer questions submitted from the audience. So before we proceed, some information for our listeners. To submit questions to our speakers at any time, use the Q&A feature you see at the bottom of your Zoom window. They will be seen by everyone. You may vote for questions you see appearing in the Q&A window to move them toward the top of the list. There's also a chat feature which is reserved for communication to resolve technical difficulties with our tech support team. So remember to submit your questions to the Q&A window. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome our first speaker, Professor Thomas Kochan. Tom, over to you.
Thank you very much, Ken, and good afternoon or good morning, depending on what time of day you are located in. I'm delighted to be part of this conversation today, and I hope it will be very much a conversation that engages all of us in this really, really critical question of our time on how do we rebuild our economies? How do we come back to work? Those of us who have continued to work, how do we welcome others back? And how do we all work together in this post-COVID world? I think this is the defining moment for us that tests our ability to see the future and to create the future. And so in the spirit of MIT, I want to emphasize how we can move forward, not to let the future shape us, but for us to help shape the future. I want to emphasize three key challenges and opportunities. One, what are we learning from this crisis about how we can build a more resilient, a more equitable, a fair, and more inclusive society. And this becomes even more critical today in light of the crisis on racial justice and the Black Lives Matter movement uprising and recognizing that we need to address these issues with some certainty, some sense of urgency, and some real commitment to deal with fairness in all of our interactions in society and in our economy. Secondly, we also have to ask, how are we going to reopen our economy in ways that bring people back and make them both productive, but also feeling safe and successful? And then I want to end my session by talking about a longer term concern that I've always had, and that is how do we build a new social contract in our economy and our society, one that meets the expectations that we have for business, for labor, for the workforce, for government, and for education, because we all have to work together to build a better economy and a better society for all. So that's the general direction that I'll go in. I welcome questions as we go along. We can break this up in any way that makes sense. But before we get to the current moment, let's put where we are in perspective. It's not surprising that there were already tensions in our economy in our society that were being felt by so many, because we have what I've described as a broken social contract, particularly here in the United States, but in this graph that comes from the US experience could be replicated in many, many parts of the world. Because it shows that if we look back at the beginning years, from the end of World War II up through the 1970s, almost up to 1980, those two lines went together. They moved up. And one line captures productivity in the economy, and the other captures average wages for working Americans. And as the economy got better, so too did average workers' wages and their families' economic status. But then they started to depart. And from the 1980s, you saw profits and productivity continue to grow, but then you saw wages essentially flatline. This, my friends, I believe, is the underlying source of tension and conflict that we experienced before this particular crisis, and why so many people were disillusioned. And as we come out of this crisis, if we don't take some actions, this could get, in fact, worse. But we can make it better. And that's our real challenge. That's our opportunity for the future. Then leading up right to the crisis of the COVID outbreak, just think of where we were in January of this year. We were in a pretty good economic state, at least on the jobs front. We had a 3.5% unemployment rate in the United States. Other countries around the world, in Europe and in Asia, had seen unemployment go down and job growth be quite solid. We still had persistent low wage growth, except we saw some improvements for those most in need at the bottom, in the United States in particular, because we did have tight labor markets, and because a number of states increased their minimum wages in response to growing pressures. And in fact, there was a deep, deep concern that was emerging around the world about debates over automation. How is new technology going to affect the future of jobs? And we'll come back to that a little bit as we talk about all of this, because I think that issue, while it might be a bit on the back burner today, is even more of a concern as we come out of this particular crisis. But we had a booming market. We had the stock market growing very, very robustly. Most of those returns in the stock market went to stock buybacks and dividends for share owners. We didn't see much return to workers from those tax cuts. And we saw, in fact, an increased number of protests. And we saw increased use of direct action by workers to take actions to try to express their concerns. And our own research and the evidence from these direct actions so that there was growing interest in having a stronger voice and having stronger unions and growing union interests in the United States. At the same time, last year, the Business Roundtable, our biggest business group in the country, came together and said, we better start responding to these concerns. We better start paying much more attention than we have in recent years to the interests of multiple stakeholders at the workplace, not just our share owners. We have to worry about employees and their communities. We have to worry about suppliers and other groups that depend on the organization. So this is where we were. And then the shock came. And basically what I want to talk about are kind of 5 lessons that I think we should take away from this shock. First, I want to talk about some of the holes that in our safety net for workers and families that were laid bare by this experience. I want to talk about how we need to build stronger trust and engagement of the workforce moving forward. And I know Christine's going to talk a lot about that in her presentation. I want to say something about how we can use technology, not to be afraid of it, but to solve many of our problems. And then focus specifically on how we return to work. And as you listen to this, I would like you all to think about and maybe put in the chat, what do you see as some of the best practices in your organization or in the organizations around you or in your communities for coming back to work? And maybe what do you see that is troubling? What are the issues that we need to address more successfully in the future if we're going to have a successful return to work? So please add your questions and comments, and then we'll turn to this longer term question about the social safety net. So let's move on to talk about what were the shock effects of this COVID crisis on the safety net. Well, the clearest issue that we faced was that in the United States, we still are stuck with the legacy healthcare system that says if you lose your job, you're likely to lose your health benefits. If anything has been demonstrated by this crisis, that system has to be changed. We had to find ways to fill the gaps for people who didn't have health care and were affected by this COVID crisis. And so I'm not arguing for a particular form of coverage, but we can't stay with a system. When employment gets shocked, so too does our healthcare system. We've got to solve that problem as we come back to work, and we have to put that at the top of our agenda. And indeed, in all of our polling, workers today put that issue at the top of their agenda for changes in our policies. But the United States also has the embarrassing situation of being the only really democratic country left in the world that doesn't have a national paid family and a paid sick leave program. We had to invent one in this crisis, and the Congress passed a makeshift policy for small businesses in particular to make sure that people would have sick leave and would have backup family leave to take care of their children as this crisis unfolded. But it's a temporary program, it's a stopgap program. It doesn't cover everyone. It still leaves out low-income workers in our large companies, and we have to make sure that we address this as we move forward. Because we are learning now that you can't have a robust and successful organization, obviously, without a workforce that is there. And you can't have a robust workforce if we don't deal with the family issues that make it difficult for people to come back to work and to sustain long hours of work in the face of childcare needs, online education, and the lack of daycare because daycare centers are closed down. So this really is the second point. The third point is we didn't learn from our European colleagues. Our European countries like Germany and Sweden and the Netherlands and Denmark emphasized keeping workers on the job. They took pay cuts to some extent and then supplemented the gap between the prior pay and the current pay with government programs, what they call short hours work. We have the legislation on the books of about half of our states to do that, but none of them really implemented it in big ways. And so we had an enormous number of people go into unemployment. Over 40 million people at some point filed for unemployment insurance. And then we had to scramble to expand that unemployment insurance to cover gig workers, independent contractors, people on temporary jobs, a whole variety of people who otherwise were outside of that unemployment insurance system to make sure that they got a supplement to keep their families from losing their homes and from having enough basic resources to survive. Well, we've got to fix that employment system. We've got to really ask, how are we going to create more incentives for employment and a broader safety net for unemployment? That's a big issue facing us. We have a crisis now coming up because some of that unemployment insurance system stopgap measures will expire at the end of July. So this is a big debate. We are seeing the biggest workforce redeployment coming up in our society today since World War II. Many of the jobs that went away are not coming back in our hospitality industries, for low-wage workers, in transportation industries, in various ways, in our retail industry that is quickly shifting to online activities, and in education perhaps as well, as we move more and more work online. We need to really invest in training to bring people back to work, make sure that they have the agility to adjust to where the jobs are in the future. And we have to invest more along those lines. And then finally, the biggest embarrassment in our safety net is the exclusion of immigrant workers. Many are not even eligible for unemployment insurance, and many are afraid who are eligible to come out because they're afraid they will get deported. And so that they're hunkering down at home. They're afraid not to go to work because they could be retaliated against, and they're really left out of all aspects of decent work in our society and the protections that we extend to workers. We've got to address this issue of immigrants because they are so essential, whether it's in meatpacking, it's in other parts of food preparation, or in our farming and agriculture, in our hospitality industries, in our recreation industries. We now know how essential immigrants are at the low end and at the high end in our high technology sectors. And so these are some of the challenges that we face moving forward. We
Tom?
also have an enormous problem with the lack of worker voice in our society. The union movement in the United States declined down to about 6% of the workforce in the private sector. And today we're hearing more and more workers calling for a new voice at work over safety, for example. How safe is our workplace? Can we have a voice in shaping a new safety culture? Can we have influence over the conditions under which we come back to work? We need to address this issue because workers are now calling for new forms of representation. Yes, more want to join a union, but it's very difficult to do that under our labor law. And so they're looking for new options, whether that's works councils like you have in Germany and in other parts of Europe, or whether it's taking the Business Roundtable's statement at its own word and saying we want a voice in corporate governance at the board of directors level. The reality is our research tells us we need multiple forms of voice and representation, and we'll talk a lot about that as we go forward. This will be a big debate in the future, and we better be prepared to address it because there's a very, very frustrated and angry workforce that is telling us through their actions and through our surveys that they don't have enough of a voice at work, and the issues on their mind cut across economic issues, respect for their rights, anti-discrimination, the need to have racial justice, and the need to have a voice in what I'm going to turn to now. And that is, how are we going to harness all these wonderful new technologies that are out there and make sure that they're not just used to replace workers, but to augment how we work? There's too much in the past where the way in which we've thought about technology has been to see it as an external force, completely independent, developed by technologists, engineers, vendors, entrepreneurs. They bring their ideas into firms, they sell it to the firms, and then they push that technology through, often by eliminating a lot of jobs. We have created, at the behest of the MIT president, Raphael Reif, a task force on work of the future here at MIT, which I'm very pleased to be part of. And one of the big emphasis that we are making in our work is that we have to shift from that old line view of technology driving everything independent of work to what we're now seeing in this crisis, more of a pull of technology to solve the big problems that we are experiencing. Technology can be a very effective tool for solving problems of deploying our production systems to produce healthcare materials and equipment, to expanding broadband and software so that we can support people who are working and going to school online at home in communities that lacked adequate services along those lines. And our best communication companies have done an outstanding job of expanding and are continuing to work on this. These are examples of how we are responding and let the problems of society define how we put technology to work to address our current problems. That means we need to start to articulate how we want to use technology. This is something we feel very strongly about at MIT. You're going to hear more about it as we go forward. You're going to be surprised by the way in which we talk about technology as a tool for solving problems and technology as an opportunity to build higher quality jobs. But we're also going to emphasize that to do so, we need to take a different approach. Instead of having that technology push, a sequential process of bringing the technology in from the outside, we believe it has to be called for by those who know how we do the work best. We link the new technology to the work processes, to the problems we're trying to solve. We train the workforce before the technology comes along, and we integrate technology with work processes effectively. We have learned from research as far back as the 1980s in the auto industry, to the IT revolution in the 1990s, to healthcare technology with automated medical records, all research that we have done here at MIT, that when you integrate technology with the workforce, with how we work, you get the highest rates of return and the best acceptance of technology and the most innovation on an ongoing basis. So I want to challenge all of us to make sure that we think about how do we bring technology to bear on our problems, and how do we do that in a sensible way going forward. Now, let's talk more specifically for a moment about navigating this return to work. How are we addressing the various concerns of the business to make a profitable and a productive return, and a resilient return, and the workforce at the same time? Well, the top issue on everyone's priority list is safety. How can we bring people back to work, keep them safe, keep our customers, our clients, our students safe as we return to campus in the fall here at MIT in some fashion? Top concern is making sure all of us are safe. That means we have to listen to all of us. We have to engage the workforce. Some of our leading companies are doing marvelous, marvelous work in coming up with the right policies and very well organized processes for bringing people back. Our HR community is at the forefront of leading a lot of those ideas, but it's not enough. Top-down leadership is a necessary but not a sufficient process. We teach about distributed leadership here at MIT and in the Sloan School, and we know that the only way you build trust is by engaging workers themselves at all levels: managers, middle managers, supervisors, employees, contractors, talking to each other about how can we support a safe work environment. That there isn't enough of that going on today, and where I'm in trouble even staffing our critical areas like hospitals and nursing homes, where the problems are so acute because people are not feeling that they are part of the solution. They are being told to come back to work, as they've been forced to do in our meatpacking plants. And so you see a lot of unrest around that. So as we come back, let's listen to the ideas, because people do want to work, but they also want to make sure that they can feel comfortable raising red flags when they see them, and finding ways to make the workplace safe. As we do this, we have to recognize that we're going to have a much more varied situation, with some people who do the same work but have very different family or underlying health care conditions, some of whom will be able to come back to work on a continuous basis, some who may be able to come in only on a limited basis, and some who will need to continue to stay at home as they make sure that they keep their families, the people who depend on them, safe because of some underlying conditions or the mix of people that they have in their homes. And so this is going to require skills in managing that variability in new ways, and making sure, again, that the teams handle some of these issues. I did some work in Seattle just as the pandemic was exploding out there in a hospital with employees, and they came up with a self-scheduling process at their workplace to make sure that the workers themselves could work through who can come in, who can't, how are we going to cover, how are we going to do this in a way that we are all feeling equitable and get the work done effectively. It was a marvelous process to watch. As we continue to work at home, we better learn how to do this in a more productive way. We need to make sure that we measure our productivity by the work we get done, and that we avoid these awful venture capitalists and venture technology companies that are coming in with all kinds of monitoring systems for knowing when I'm on the screen, what I'm doing on that screen, when I'm caring for a family member, when I'm taking a break to get some badly needed exercise, when I'm taking time for lunch. There's too much of that monitoring going on, and too many vendors out there selling these kinds of systems. Let's make sure that we reward people for getting work done, not for the time on the screen. In doing this, we have to also simulate how do we get the social side of innovation, what we might have called the water cooler conversations and discussions, simulated sometimes with small breakout groups, sometimes with afternoon so-called Zoom cocktail parties, sometimes with spontaneous meetings that can also be fostered online. But we've got to find a way not to lose that social innovation as we move forward. And that means we all have to make sure that we are better trained and skilled at managing virtual meetings. And our IT people are our greatest resource. At MIT, they have really helped us to learn how to manage this technology, to get comfortable with it, how to tell jokes on technology, and how to use it effectively. So let's make sure that this is part of our toolkit as individuals, as managers, as leaders, as professionals. There's an enormous amount of concern around mental health out there. There's enormous tension in our society and many unmet needs for healthcare, particularly mental health, going unabated right now. Let's make sure we listen to each other. We take care of each other, not only of our neighbors, but of our coworkers, and welcome each other back and find ways to really check in, make sure that we take care of our communities moving forward. This will be critical to managing the work of the future. And it's even more critical now with the Black Lives Matters sensitivities. We have to recognize that these are deep, deep emotional scars. Let's listen to the sources of racism that people experience on an everyday basis. Let's deal with them in a straightforward way. Let's identify all with the need for racial justice and use a racial justice lens as a way of moving forward. Finally, let me come back to this longer term challenge. The deep divisions we have in our societies, political divisions, racial divisions, social divisions, divisions by economic inequality. If we don't address these, we will not have a vibrant economy or a resilient economy or a productive economy. That means we have to cross these lines and begin to work together, entrepreneurs and technology vendors with employers and labor force representatives, educators learning how we can reach people in new ways, and yes, informing government leaders of what we need. I believe building a new social contract where we all can benefit and all can prosper together is the challenge of our time coming out of this crisis. If we don't do it well, then this crisis will continue, and the anger and the frustration that we are experiencing today could even escalate into something worse. None of us want that. We can work together. MIT has always been a leader in ideas and a leader in action. So let's put all of our effort and all of our energy to work in addressing these needs for the future. So let me stop there and see if we've generated questions and how we want to proceed to the next state.
So some questions have come up very much about this idea of changing the way we've been doing business. In the past, many organizations were hierarchical structures with leadership at the top making all of the decisions and the majority of people holding on. With the current disruption, there were a lot of layoffs, and people might be reticent or afraid to ask what they feel is more equitable. How can you encourage or even enforce collective responsibility when in the past attention has been paid to shareholder value and not necessarily to stakeholder participation?
Well, that's a very good question. It's a tough question, but I think we're seeing that workers are taking actions on their own. Today, Whole Foods, one of our premier grocery chains owned by Amazon, now it is experiencing a protest because the employees are saying that Whole Foods isn't doing enough to deal with racial justice. And some people wanted to wear masks, protective masks that say Black Lives Matter, and the company said no. So that triggered a protest, and that's going on as we speak today. We've seen similar things at Amazon. We've seen similar things earlier at Google. We've seen things across the country where people are using more and more direct action. They're also using creative use of social media. They're using social media to write petitions and to get them to the CEOs and to the top leaders, and that has helped in some cases. We're seeing much more labor management cooperation in our unionized settings. I mentioned being out in a hospital in Seattle just as the pandemic was starting, and there we created a new labor management partnership to work together as they come out of this crisis and to stay together beyond. And they work to redeploy people in the hospitals where needed and to find ways to support with backup childcare the people who could not come to work for all the reasons we know. And so we need more cooperation that way. We need to build more collective voice. We need to take advantage of the fact that all organizations want to build a new safety culture. So let's make sure that we organize and we bring our ideas to bear and assert those ideas with our managers and our supervisors and work together to monitor the safety standards, the safety practices that are being put in place. So I think we're going to see more activism. I think we also could see at the state level and at the regional level and at the industry level, business and other groups, employee groups come together to say, what are the best practices? How can we learn from others in our sector to make sure that we're all staying safe and that we're all addressing our basic issues? So I think we're going to continue to see more activism. Our surveys tell us workers have a voice gap at work today where they want more of a voice. I know Christine is going to emphasize worker engagement a lot in her remarks, and so I would invite her to add comments to this as well.
Okay, another question. So underlying the graph that you showed at the beginning, where there was wages stagnated, but productivity went up. Some people might argue that this was the result of introducing new technology. Maybe it had something to do with globalization. Maybe we've created a digital divide. How do you bring people together so that they all have the right skills to compete and to thrive in this new marketplace that you propose?
Well, it's very clear that technology and globalization contributed to that gap, but it's a mistake to think that they were the only forces. Another force that leading economists now are finally coming around to agreeing with the research that we've done in our work group over the years that says it was the decline of the labor movement and the weakness of workers in the last 30 years or so that has contributed to that gap as well. And so we have to find new ways, modern ways, to strengthen worker voice at the workplace to close that gap. But then you're absolutely right, that we have to close the digital divide. And that's why education is so much an important player in this new social contract building process. We have to use all of the tools for lifelong learning. Apprenticeships to start off with in bringing people into the technical workforce, and then continuous learning for not only technicians, but managers, blue collar workers. All of us are capable of learning if we're given the opportunity to learn on the job and to learn by using some of the online resources, not to necessarily go back to work, I'm sorry, back to school for advanced degrees all in one time period, because most people can't take that kind of time off, but on a continuous basis, on a part time basis, on a project by project basis, where you can go and find online courses to help you learn a new piece of software or technology to address a project need in your organization. That blended learning process of our universities like MIT and our community colleges working together with industry and with the workforce is the key to the future. We're all trying to make that happen. Our leading companies are doing a pretty good job of turning to that. We've taken a little bit of a setback during this crisis. We're going to have to accelerate those efforts moving forward.
Okay, thank you, Tom, for your thoughts. At this point, I'd like to transition to Christine. And then, as I said before, when she's done, then the both of you can answer some of the questions that are accumulating, each from a different point of view.